The Chimera Ant arc in one of the greatest stories of all time, Hunter x Hunter, written by Togashi, is undoubtedly one of the best shonen arcs of all times. Actually, it's one of the best arcs of all times. All the actors, all the characters flawlessly moving together in that palace invasion with millions of episodes of build-up. And yet, despite this, there is one character that really holds the lifeline of the arc together, and that is the antagonistic force of Meruem. More than characters like Gon's development or Killua's development, without a great dynamic antagonist like Meruem, it would be really hard to make an arc that great. So, what makes Meruem such a great character? Well, first, we need to analyze what the role of a villain in a story is. Concretely, there are 3 parts to a villain that need to be done well in order to create the ideal villain, and Meruem does parts 2 and 3 very well. Let me get into the basics of each part first. Part 1, or the character's build-up and introduction. For Meruem, this part is his weakest part. At the start, we have the hyping of Meruem when he's still in the Queen Ant. We have him known as the king and referred to in this archaic tone. Yet, we don't really get anything of his character in this part. All we know is that he's an absolute villain with nearly no goodness in his heart. We can see this through his original actions. His first actions after coming out of the mother's womb is just to kill her and another Chimera Ant that did nothing wrong. Meruem kills them just for the sake of showing that he has more power over them. Yet, despite this being a scarily great introduction to a character, it does not give us much insight to Meruem, and thus, he really does have a lackluster part 1. The part 1 of the character is meant to build up their ideology and hype them up, and then we want to see that ideology in part 2 with their actions. Well, he does hit the hype up because we all see when he's in his mother's womb. We never really see his ideology carried through actions, and that's what really holds Meruem's part 1 back. For example, of another monster archetype character comes from the aptly named story Monster, written by Naoki Urasawa. In this story, the main antagonist, which I'm not going to name in spoiler terms, has a great part 1 where we see his dynamic ideology, and this was not even hyped up this much. This reveal came out of nearly nowhere and happened 4 episodes in. And I strongly recommend go seeing Monster if you haven't seen it. It's a great insight into character writing, and I believe the parallels between the main antagonist and Meruem are there, and no one really realizes this. Another great introduction, who I'm not going to name in fear of spoiler again, is the main villain of Bleach. He has nearly no hype up. You don't really know who he is. All you know is that he is the traitor. And you know that he does horrible actions like killing one of the strongest characters in the show 26 episodes in. Yet, you don't really get any hype around his character. But that is part 1 in his introduction near the end of the arc, where you get an insight into his ideology and why he's doing all these actions, really cements him as one of the greatest antagonists of all time. So with that being said, when we compare this back to Meruem, do we really know anything about him other than he is strong and he has the perceptual duty of being the king? We really don't. And that's why I firmly believe that Meruem's part 1 falls flat as a character. Meruem does not really have a set goal except to kill all the humans, and he does this unquestionably. In this sense, he reflects the perceived ideals of a king. He has a set duty, and his goal is to carry out that perceived duty in the best way. This is more developed in his part 2, which is why I'll explain it more then. So now, let's talk about Meruem's part 2 and where he really starts to shine as a character. For me, the first moment where Meruem shines as a character is in his first conversation with Komugi during the arc. Komugi is one of the most human characters in the Chimera Ant arc of Hunter x Hunter, and I would argue that it is one of the lifelines of the arc. Without her there isn't excuse for Meruem to develop that much, and through losing, he gains a new perspective of what it means to be strong and how even humans could have that attribute. This fits the part 2 section of the villain so well, because it highlights their ideology and shows the effect on the world around them. Similarly to a protagonist, because obviously a protagonist and an antagonist have to reflect each other, a protagonist's greatest strength is how the world affects him and how he affects the world. The antagonist has to have both of those same settings in their evolution. And as we've just mentioned, Meruem certainly fits this mold. We see his growing advancement in his ideology through 2 key ways. He still has the set duty and wanting to be a king, but he explores the idea of what it means to be a king more accurately. Originally, his idea and perception of being a king was just being the strongest, which we can see through his actions in East Gorto, where he just kills the person because they were weaker than him. However, after playing with Komugi, he realizes that being a king is not necessarily just being the strongest, rather, it's the prerogative of the strongest to become the king. With this outlook on life, he gains 2 new parts to his ideology. The first is he gains respect. Meruem has nearly no respect for any humans in the series before this because he believes that because they are weaker than the king, that they are weaker than him, they don't deserve any respect. However, the insight into his games with Komugi end up breeding respect in him. Respect is fueled by a sense of equality in some shape or form and is an ideal. Meruem learned from Komugi first because she was a rival to his strength, his ideal. Meruem, the greatest person at evolving, ended up losing to someone who he perceived weaker than him. And this spills over to later parts of Meruem's character. We can see this in the last actions of the arc and then Netero versus Meruem battle 2. Because this is really a battle of the same ideology, rather in a different sense. We can see that Meruem as a character knows his duty, and he knows that he only wants to keep the strongest humans alive because he still subscribes to the duty that only the strongest can live. But now, he doesn't want to kill all the humans, rather he wants to eliminate the weak as a whole. Because Netero is a strong human with a strong sense of justice, he now wants to keep Netero alive. In the other sense, this does reflect Netero's ideology as well, but we'll get on to that later. The important point to notice is that this shows the perspective of being a monster and being a king. Meruem is the biological monster in this scenario, but when this fight begins, I would argue that he subscribes more to the king classification. When the fight begins, Netero is the aggressor and Meruem isn't. It's an ironic reversal of the 2 traditional portrayals of the character. Meruem is portrayed as being some kind of monster, and Netero is perceived as being the strongest human who, as we've already gained insight into Meruem's whole ideology, by that makes it his prerogative to be the king. When the fight starts, we see the monster acting like a king and keeping up his sense of justice by not killing the strong, and we see the king act like a monster by working to go and actively kill those who would oppose him. This is a really potent dynamic storytelling in Hunter x Hunter and really served to develop Meruem as a character. Now, let's look a bit more into the fight as a whole. When Netero uses the Guanyin Bodhisattva, the ultimate Nen incarnation of mercy and forgiveness, to destroy someone, while Meruem is actually the real figurative king in this sentence, attempting to show mercy and understanding. This sort of shows the reversal in roles, again, as I've been stating, as Netero is the one doing all these monster actions. He's the one wanting to fight someone who does not want to fight him, and rather, Meruem is the understanding one. This also comes into effect as you clearly can see that Meruem is doing the right thing here. He refuses to fight Netero despite it being in his best interest too, because he doesn't have any need to. As a king, he has no desire to go and randomly kill people who he perceives to be fit to live in his world. It isn't until he gets the stakes of being named something that he so thoroughly lusts that he would ever go and try to fight Netero. This gives us even more insight into his character and the whole role of a king in the story. The typical king in most stories is shown to be lusting, and Meruem completely embodies this, as he is lusting for the things that he does not desire, or that he does not have, because he is born with the natural talent for everything. This shows very big parallel to other typical king characters in other stories. I'd say one clean example that I can think of is Akashi Seijuro from Kuroko no Basket. In that story, Akashi perceives himself to be the king of the basketball court. He has the eye that lets him see what everyone around him is doing, and he always lusts the feeling of strength, always lusts the ability to be better than everyone else. And in the end, he is better than everyone else, and that's why he's the self-proclaimed and aptly proclaimed by all the other generations of miracles, king of the court in that story. Akashi Seijuro learns to just control those around him by the virtue of him being the strongest, and that's really the insight to his character as a whole. Another clear example of this can be seen through another story such as Haikyuu, where you have the king of the court in Kageyama, but then you have the real king of the court in Oikawa. And although Kageyama fits more to the mold of the natural king, because he is the one that is always lusting to get better at volleyball, he's the one trying to control every motion around him, there's no doubt that both of these characters fit the same mold. So, we've gone over how Meruem learned to respect those around him, and that was one sense of his growing ideology. So what's the other sense? Well, it's his growing humanity. Just through his actions with Komugi, we see how the monster is slowly shifting into becoming a human, and this directly intertwines with his other sense of ideology as we see through the Netero fight like I just talked about. I believe the crow scene that is going to play is a perfect insight for this. The crow scene where Meruem saves Komugi when he doesn't have to, when he's going there to kill her, shows his insight into becoming more human. He understands that Komugi is someone fit to live in his new world. He understands that he has no need to kill her. In fact, he respects her for managing to beat him. And it shows a growing sense of his humanity, as now he doesn't want to just kill all those who oppose him. Rather, he wants to savor the strong. He stops killing so much unnecessarily, and he starts to learn the value of a life from one whose life has already been shattered, and that of Komugi. This can also be seen as he does not want to fight Netero near the end of the arc, like we just talked about. So let's recap. Why is Meruem's Phase 2 so strong? It's because his growing ideology and learning to become more of a human, which is a massive role reversal in the story of Hunter x Hunter, and really contextualizes the bad guys as the good guys. In fact, I would say this is the presiding theme in the entire arc, as you see this with characters like Yuppie, who also learn to become more of a human, but we'll talk more about that in a Yuppie character analysis if this does well enough. I would say, in the flip side, we'll talk about Gon at the end, because it's very obvious that Gon is the character that starts to lose his humanity near the end. So, let's just go over another stereotypical Part 2 villain that is done very well. I would say that this could go to Madara Uchiha from the Naruto franchise. Madara has his set ideology, and while it does not advance, you get an insight and more in-depth into what he is trying to do with the world that recontextualizes the story as a whole, because now you no longer perceive him as the villain, because he is the one who is morally in the right. And this can be said, this is a extreme similarity to Meruem, as you get more in-depth into Meruem's character, you see that throughout all these fights, Meruem could be perceived as morally right. But now, Let's go over to the third part, the ending as a villain. As an antagonist, Meruem does not fulfill this at all. But why? Because Meruem does not end the story of Hunter x Hunter as a villain. He ends the story of Hunter x Hunter as a king. This part 3 has to have some character achieve their end goals and reflect their final actions on which the character parallels. Meruem does this perfectly. This can be summed up in a pretty simple sentence. The poetic ending of a monster being the one with the happy ending, he evolved from his primitive monster form into a true king, which was what he was born to be. So at the same time, you have all this dynamic improvement in character that we see through Meruem, but it all ends up evolving back into the same very thing that he was born for, being a king. And that's why I firmly believe that no one understands Meruem, because even until his ending moments, everyone perceives him as a villain. Whereas he's not necessarily the villain of the story, rather he is just the one true king. So, we've gone over Meruem in a sense, and we've gotten a really good insight into his character. So now, how does Meruem affect all the characters around him? I believe Meruem parallels 3 characters in the story really strongly, and 1 meme character. I'm not going to talk about Pitou because I strongly disagree with the parallels between Meruem and Pitou, and I do not think Pitou is a mirror image of Meruem just because they both develop into becoming more of a human. I really do think they are polar opposite characters, and I do not think that the argument that just because they both develop makes them similar. So, in case you were looking for that, I do not believe that Pitou represents Meruem at all. The first and the main one that we've talked about is Netero. We see Netero represents Meruem because they both subscribe to a sense of duty. Meruem has his duty he has his duty as the king to kill all those who he doesn't want to be in his new world, whereas Netero has his duty as the supposed king of the humans, as the strongest Nen user, to eradicate any threats. But you clearly see Netero subscribes to Meruem's ideals throughout the story. In fact, he is the one who is subscribing to the monster ideals of wanting to eradicate someone who doesn't want to do anything with him. In this sense, we can see Netero is the one subscribing to all these twisted ideals and playing the role of the monster in the story, whereas Meruem is honestly being the king. So, they both parallel as they believe in their sense of duty, and we've talked about this pretty in depth. I don't think I need to go on it anymore. But there is one quote from this fight that really stuck out to me. When Netero says, "I want to end this before you sway my heart." That quote really shows a dual meaning. Firstly, it gives us insight into how Netero even admits Meruem is right as a character, but because both of them have been sworn to a sense of duty, Netero cannot give up. And in that sense, they're basically the same character. Whereas Meruem is the literal king, and therefore he has the right to decide how he wants to change his sense of duty. Whereas Netero is just the figurative king, so he does not get the right to decide to change his duty. Rather, he has to follow the duties that everyone else assigns him. And that is the key difference into their character. It also represents the dual meaning of proving that Netero's use of the rose bomb was to prevent himself from getting swayed by Meruem in the first place. The next character is very obvious, and I'm sure everyone was thinking of this: Gon and Meruem. This one is the exact opposite of the Netero situation. Whereas in the Netero situation, they were just paralleling each other by one being the literal king and the other being a figurative king, and one being the true king and the other being the true monster. In Gon's case, it's one evolving into becoming more human and the other one devolving into becoming a monster. Gon starts off as one of the most human characters in the show. He's not overtly strong. He has not been tortured since he was born like Killua. But yet, through the actions around him, and the world around him, and through Kite's death, he ends up devolving into becoming a monster. Whereas Meruem as a character ends up evolving into a more human character through his actions with Komugi. And I do think this one is fairly obvious, and anyone who watched Hunter x Hunter should understand it, so I'm not going to go super far in depth on it. The third character I believe Meruem really relates to is kind of an understated one, and I think Meruem parallels Knuckle very well, in the sense that it mostly stems from the crow scene. In the crow scene, again, we see Meruem saving Komugi, which he doesn't necessarily have to do. Why? Because at that part of the story, Meruem does believe Komugi is his friend, and he will do anything as a king to protect that friend. This obviously parallels both Knuckle and Killua in a sense, as they both want to pass on the torch of friendship and kindness in the story, as aptly put in Alexander's video on this. Yet, in Knuckles' case, he ends up giving all of his sense of duty up to protect that friend. And in Meruem's case, the same thing happens. He gives up his sense of duty as a king to kill anyone who crosses him, and instead chooses to evolve himself as a king and change his ideology around one person that he now perceives as being close to him. And I believe this is a really understated connection between these two characters that most people do not catch. In short, Knuckle and Meruem both change their outlook on life and basically change everything in order to protect their friends. Knuckle abandons his sense of duty, and Meruem has to change it, while he doesn't necessarily abandon it. So we've gone on basically every character, but there's one last character that I believe Meruem relates to, and that last character is Leorio. Why? Because Meruem is also truth. And just like Leorio, who is also truth, they are both telling you that over 40% of you have not liked and subscribed. It does not take that much. Please just scroll down and check if you've hit that big red button. Sometimes YouTube glitches out and unsubscribes you. So please, like and subscribe and tell me, who do you want next? I'm thinking that the next video will probably be an Eren analysis. But have a great day.